Let's explore Kegan stage 2, ego development's opportunist or self-protective stage, and Clare Graves' CP or spiral dynamics red stage. And let's see how they seem similar, how they seem different, at least according to me, and what we might take out of that as to be approximately true about human beings and their psychology. This is Jürgen Rasmussen, by the way. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. By the way, if you haven't watched part 1 in this video series, I urge you to go back and do it. This will be easier and more enjoyable, and you'll get more out of it if you do that first. Now, before we look at the red Oppurtunist Kegan stage 2, we got to backtrack a little bit. Now, realize this: Clare Graves in Spiral Dynamics is exclusively a adult developmental psychological model. It does not at all concern itself with how children develop. Jane Loevinger's ego development model, for the most part too, concerns itself with adults. After all, it was kind of pioneered through having people write finish written sentence stems. And how can you do that with kids? It's very, very difficult. And Kegan's model too is largely an adult psychological developmental model. But it gets a little bit tricky in the beginning here. So remember that Kegan's model is rooted in subject-object theory. At any stage of development, you're subject to some stuff, and there's other stuff you can take as objects. So Kegan's stage 0 is the infant who's all subjects. It's just an undifferentiated mass of sensory experience. Nothing is objects, right? There's no language, there's no distinctions. Kegan's stage 1 is the very young child who has a very magical, completely egocentric, impulse-driven, fused with their own perceptions type thinking style. So I'll give an example of this. When my son was 3 or 4 years old, I could be talking to his grandfather on the phone and hand my son the phone, and my son would complete a conversation with his grandfather that he had had in his head that his grandfather had not been part of, and have no recognition that his grandfather has no idea what he's talking about. He could also on the phone be showing his grandfather stuff while having no appreciation that, sure, I can see this being in this room, but my grandfather, who's on the west coast of Norway, has no chance to see any of this. That the young child who's subject to his own impulses and perceptions is not able to make the distinction that I can see something which you can't, and you can see or hear or understand something that I have no access to. They're too egocentric in that sense to be able to make such a distinction. Classically, too, if you took them on top of a big building, they might look down and say, look at those small people, or look at those tiny cars. And their older brother might smack them on the head and say, you idiot, it only looks that way. The cars are just as big, they only look smaller. And that's because the older child, who's likely Kegan stage 2, can take those perceptions as object and say, yeah, it only looks that way, right? So as far as I understand Kegan's theory, adults don't really function at Kegan stage 1, at least not any functional adult who's not mentally retarded. I get the same impression too when I look at ego development theory that the equivalent of Kegan's stage 1 is not something that you would likely see in an adult. You would likely see it in a young child. And if you saw it in an adult, it would probably be someone who was mentally challenged or retarded in some way. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that Clare Graves, his first stage, Beige, was a stage that he just called the kind of animalistic survival stage. These were people who essentially lived like other animals, where life consisted of responding to physiological tensions and urges and, fleeing, fighting, freezing, fucking, that sort of stuff. Um, Christopher Cowan recommended this book during his training called The Mountain People, which was about the Eek group in Uganda and how anthropologists who had visited that particular tribe were shocked by how these people who lived in extremely rough life circumstances seemed to be living in such a way that was completely devoid of any love or any humanity. They were literally starving their own children, grabbing food from their kids' mouths, uh, no burial routines, nothing, right? Um, Ego development theory or Kegan's model does not talk about this. Also, very interestingly, Clare Graves had a BO system, or what spiral dynamics called purple, which he read about through anthropology texts and also discovered, among certain tribes, where you have a animistic, very magical, tribal, ritualistic thinking style, where it's not thinking of spirits in and of itself, but it's this conceptualizations that spirits are everywhere and spirits are what make things happen. Here you have people or not people based upon bloodline, you know, clans. You have an emphasis on ritual, magic, superstition, taboos, witchcraft. This is the sort of thinking you would see in voodoo curses, again, witchcraft, cannibalism, if not done for the purpose of survival, would be sometimes typical with this purple meaning making system. No sense of linear time, or if they did, the future would be framed, the past would be in front of them. Very tribal, and a very magical thinking style. Now, a very interesting question then is what is the relationship, if any, between the young child in the Western world who is subject to his or her own impulses and perceptions, and perhaps the grown adult who lives as part of some clan? Is this the same form of mind? Is it a more mature expression of the same form of mind? Um, is this an insult or a very Western kind of patronizing way of viewing other cultures? Or is it, as some anthropologists have claimed, that these people literally are like children in their meaning making? I don't know. I've never spent any time with such a tribe or seen any of this. This, according to Graves and Beck and Cowan, this form of mind is quite active in many places in Africa and in other tribal societies. It's a sort of meaning making that during the HIV pandemic would have many African men think that if they had sex with a virgin, that could cure, for example, the HIV. So, all right. So, Kegan stage two, then, it's always easier to start with Kegan because Kegan concerns himself only with structure. It's the purest of these models. Kegan's model only concerns itself with structure and from what subject object balance someone seems to be making meaning. His model does not concern itself with themes or motives or whether you self express or self deny, as spiral dynamics and ego development theory does, which is more into the content of what people think as well. So if we look at Kegan stage 2, this is a person who has a completely egocentric meaning making thinking style, although not as egocentric as when they were fused with their impulses and perceptions, because now they can take their impulses and perceptions as objects. Now they're fused with their more enduring interests, their enduring perceived needs and wants and wishes. So they might say, I like playing football, or I like chocolate cake. And it's assumed that this is likely going to be true in a week, and or was also likely true a week ago. They can see that you have a different perspective than them. And they're interested in what you think to the extent that it impacts them. So for people who operate here, who have that very egocentric thinking style, who are viewing everything through the lens of their own enduring interests and wishes and perceived needs, you're going to be a kind of supplier to the self, meaning you can be useful in terms of helping them get something or accomplish something that they want, or you're kind of in the way. That's who you are to someone who operates here. So relationships then tend to be very transactional, and they can easily blow up. There's no shared intimacy or shared meaning or anything like that. It's transactional in the sense of perhaps I scratch your back and you scratch mine. There's a very short term focus, very often a quite hedonistic, sensory pleasure, in the moment type orientation. Um, a very black and white, concrete thinking style. What you won't see when someone operates here is a lot of self reflection. You know, they don't really have an inner self or subjectivity to share. They can tell you what they think and feel to some extent, but they don't really have thoughts about their thoughts or feelings about their feelings. They're not insecure or self conscious in that sort of sense. They have a tendency to externalize blame. They don't take responsibility in the way we expect of an adult. And the reason why, from a structural level, is because they can take multiple perspectives one at a time. To be able to take personal responsibility, you have to be able to take an idea of what you want right now and an idea of what you want later, and you have to be able to kind of coordinate them and experience them simultaneously at the same time. And that way, a future can become real to you, and future consequences can impact you emotionally. So it's not that teenagers, for example, lack impulse control. They can take their impulses as objects. It's just that they don't yet coordinate multiple perspectives simultaneously. Uh, Now, if you look at spiral dynamics and ego development theory, though, ego development theory makes the same claim that this is a person who's fused with his own wishes, wants, and desires. So the thinking style is completely egocentric. It's hedonistic. It's in the moment. Um, there's a lack of guilt. This is something that all of these systems agree upon, that people who operate here don't really have guilt. They may say they have guilt, but if you inquire into what that means, you'll see that it's more a type of worry about being caught. It's not really guilt. There's shame though. There's a strong emphasis on not losing face or not being shamed. And if you view this from the spiral dynamics lens, in addition to not being shamed or losing face, there's often a strong emphasis or theme on heroism. You know, not being a sissy, not being a coward, not backing down, um, these sorts of things. Kegan, in his 1994 book In Over Our Heads, has some wonderful uh, pointers to this way of thinking. There's this bank robber called Willie Sutton who's interviewed by a journalist, and the journalist asks, why do you rob these banks, Willie? And he says, because that's where they keep the money. And you see, it's this very concrete thinking style. It's not abstractions. So what this form of mind doesn't do is there's no real subjectivity, there's no real self-reflection, there's no idealism. There's nothing about being part of something bigger than the self or belonging to something or being devoted to some sort of cause. No guilt again, not really a conscience. Those things hopefully come online in the next meaning making stage. So, this I would say is likely the stage of development where these three different models are most aligned. I think what Kegan's system would point out, though, is that someone who operates here might be self sacrificing if they perceive it in their best interest to be so. So Graves has this conceptualization of express self now, to hell with others, to hell with the consequences. Something else, too, that I think spiral dynamics might be missing a little bit here is that someone who operates here might be operating very kindly in the world in the sense that they might be self interested in being a kind person. Um, but there's a very interesting example from Philip M. Lewis' book, The Discerning Heart, which I really recommend on Kegan's model, where he writes about this young man who walks up to an old woman, grabs her by the hand, takes her luggage, and walks her to the other side of the streets. And the old lady says, thanks, old man, thanks, young man, but I was waiting for someone back there to pick me up. And the point of this was that he wasn't kind to her because she needed help. He was kind because he had a need to be kind. And what he couldn't do was to create a shared context of meaning, so to speak. Someone who operates here might be kind or might be protective, not necessarily because you need kindness or protection, but because they have some interest or need to either come across or to express themselves that way. I think something else that Kegan's model would emphasize compared to spiral dynamics is that spiral dynamics has this conceptualization of express yourself impulsively with no long-term consequences. Kegan's stage two seems to be a bit more complex in the sense that it acknowledges that these folks can actually take their impulses as objects. So someone who operates here might actually be planning a little bit over time. It might be the adult student who works hard at school, or or the adult or the young athlete who's very serious about his sport and goes to practice every day to become the best in the world at his particular sport and might be very conscientious about that. So I think that's something that Kegan's model would differ on um, a little bit. Um, Something else too, when you look at spiral dynamics, all the examples are of males and essentially the bad guy in any movie, the prison population, the the, the people who do drunken driving and get into bar brawls, uh, this sort of stuff. But if if this is a universal stage of development, which I think it is, this egocentric stage, by the way, most common probably from the ages of 12 till late teens, where most people kind of get socialized, and then perhaps 10, 11, 12% of the population either just partially or never quite get socialized, so they still operate from this particular place. Those are perhaps more the people you see in the bar brawls at the local pub and who end up in prison repeatedly and do the drunken driving and the irresponsible, reckless behaviors. Um, but from a more female perspective, remember, females don't necessarily have the physical strength to dominate, but they might use destroying someone's reputation, for example. So, or they might use victimhood, like cloak themselves in a kind of victim role to get benefits from others and to get what they want by being weak, essentially, and being parasitic. That's another way of expressing this. One interesting claim that the guy I just mentioned, Philip M. Lewis, who wrote The Discerning Heart, he claimed that jealousy was exclusively a Kegan stage 2 phenomena. He would claim that, so again, when people are at Kegan stage 2, or uh, the opportunist stage or the red stage, the relationships tend to be very transactional because there's no shared intimacy in a sense. And what happens when people move to that third stage, the socialized mind, is that they begin to internalize other significant people's perspectives on them and kind of co-create their own sense of self based upon those. So how you perceive me become a big part of how I experience myself. So I kind of feel loved and validated as a result of internalizing your love for me. And Lewis's claim is that people at stage 2 can't do that in a relationship, and therefore they need the constant validation through behavior. It's an interesting theory. I've never heard Beck or Cowan or Graves claim this. I haven't heard this from Loevinger's writings or Susanne Greuter. I'm very convinced that it's a false claim. I see clients all day, done so for the last 27 years. I have seen, I hardly see people from Kegan Stage 2 or the Oppurtunist as psychotherapy clients or coaching clients. They tend not to. They tend not to come in because they're not psychologically oriented. When these folks have psychological issues, what you might call depression or anxiety, it's more a failure to kind of be able to get what they want or things getting in the way. So I used to run a self-defense school and teach martial arts for 16 years. I think I've helped way more people at Kegan Stage 2 in that way than I ever have as a coach or as a agent of change or psychotherapist. But my point being that I've seen people with jealousy issues from all over the spectrum in terms of stages of development. So I'm very sure that that's not the case. Something interesting too that Kegan claims um, in his book In Over Our Heads is that whatever else might be going on with those we label psychopaths, at least that stage two structure seems to be operating. So if we look at what's often called psychopathy or a person with, you know, moderate or highly psychopathic traits, we tend to find a kind of bold, fearless personality style, someone who's kind of high on certain aspects of extroversion and quite low on neuroticism. We tend to find a kind of callousness, a cold, lack of connection type temperament. And we tend to find someone who's disinhibited or low on conscientiousness. And if you have those, and you also have that Kegan stage 2 or red or opportunist, then you have something that really looks like a psychopath, someone who's completely egocentric and who spends his or her time as a kind of predatory parasite who's preying on other people and looking to outfox them, outwit them, trick them, manipulate them, exploit them, and uh, so he seems to imply that if someone has psychopathic, someone's a psychopath essentially, or highly psychopathic, that they're going to be operating at Kegan's stage 2. Um, I haven't heard anything in particular about psychopathy in ego development theory, but I've studied, when I studied spiral dynamics, they would make the claim that A, don't confuse CP or red with unkind. Someone who operates here might take good care of you if you don't challenge, and if you're nice to them and you seem you seem useful, right? But they would claim that you could find psychopathy in any system, that it's not restricted to that red system. And it's kind of interesting to look at that. I remember watching a true crime documentary a while back where a guy had killed a woman who was pregnant with his child because he didn't want to pay child support or be bothered, and he orchestrated that killing in a very deceiving, devoid of any conscience type of way, and had no guilt or no remorse or no nothing, right? So quite psychopathic. And he was never caught, but then a few years later he had discovered Christianity, and then he went to the police himself and he confessed because he was scared that if he didn't confess to this murder, he would not get into heaven. So this is likely a person then who's still psychopathic, uh, doesn't really care about anyone else, but who has entered that blue stage of spiral dynamics or Graves' DQ system, which is about saintly behavior, which is about sacrificing self now for reward later, often in the afterlife. So I thought that was an interesting example. There's a psychopathy researcher by the name of Kevin Dutton who has written a book called The Wisdom of Psychopaths, and he did some surveys where he was looking at the professions where you found the most folks with psychopathic traits. Now, these are likely not the top end folks with psychopathic traits. Uh, I think Kegan's probably right there that the really psychopathic people probably never leave stage 2, right? But number 1 was CEOs and number 2 were lawyers. And probably quite a few lawyers are at Kegan stage 2, right? But some of them also probably have that capacity to do formal operations and might be, having evolved slightly further. And there's a woman called M.e Thomas who has written a book called Confessions of a Sociopath. And she has her own YouTube channel, and she has some videos on something called Psychopathy Is, which is an interesting website. And she talks about, as a psychopath, being a Mormon and being religious. And she makes the claim that quite a few people with strong psychopathic traits find religion, for example, attractive because she has no conscience. She has no guilt. She has no conscience. She has no remorse. But she's cognitively complex enough and has enough perspective, and her life has had enough scandals that she's had the realization that she can't really live in that predatory way. So having a religion then, contributes a kind of outer structure, a rule set for right or wrong, how to treat people. That even if you don't feel any of it, you can use it as a roadmap. Now, is that a person who operates from stage 2 and uses the religion in a sense, or is it someone who internalizes that and co-construct a more complex sense of self as a result of that? Another really interesting thing here is that there's a guy called Andy McNabb, who's this war hero who's written a bunch of books, and he's a clinically diagnosed psychopath. Spent a lot of time with Kevin Dutton. And when you listen to interviews with him, he seems very Kegan stage 2. There's not really much self-reflection. There doesn't seem to be much of an inner life to share. Doesn't seem to be much fear or guilt or conscience or anything like that going on. And he kind of confirms that himself. And when he came home to his wife and said, guess what? I'm a psychopath. I just got it kind of diagnosed. His wife said, what else is new? I've known that for years. But what his wife did, which was kind of interesting and a good example in terms of the religious example I just used, is that he, of course, was not good at empathizing or reading, if you will, her emotional states because he doesn't really have them in the same way. So she would create these emojis of different facial expressions of sadness and fear and stuff like that, and say to him, Andy, when I look like this, you can go make some tea. And she kind of created this system for him, and he was bragging about it in interviews and saying, my wife is happy, I'm happy, this is working, quite well. A final little thing here about how these systems might differ. It's 2024. It's right before the US election as I make this video. I don't want to get too political. My own preferences are libertarian, so I neither like the preferences nor the personality styles of any of these candidates. I'm not even a US citizen, so I couldn't vote anyways. But I think you could make a good claim that Donald Trump probably mainly operates from Kegan's stage 2. Now, why would I make that claim? Well, he's extremely egocentric and narcissistic. And if the theories is correct, you would see the most narcissism from Kegan stage 2. It's this protection against any shame or any vulnerable emotions, any any tendency to feel any of these so-called vulnerable emotions is very threatening or very dangerous. So the narcissism often seems to be a front or a way to compensate from that. Um, you never see Trump take any personal responsibility for anything, and you might say, Jurgen, you're completely unreasonable. No politician pretty much ever does, and you're right. You're right about that. But he seems to have an extra gear in terms of blaming others and never being able to handle any criticism in a sense and being completely thin-skinned. He seems to have an orientation of pathological lying, no commitment to truth telling whatsoever, doesn't seem to have any remorse or any guilt, wild exaggerations, just wild level of lying. Um, he doesn't seem to self reflect, he doesn't seem to share any of his own subjective inner world. It doesn't seem to have any of that to share. Uh, he never seems to share any empathy or compassion or any of those types of virtues. It's probably framed as a weakness. And there's a kind of impulsivity. If you read interviews or watch documentaries with people who have worked for him, you can see that he might very impulsively make a particular decision and then reverse it 2 hours later without offering any rationale or anything like that. A lot of bullshitting, a lot of con artistry, a lot of manipulation, very hostile sense of humor, a way of kind of organizing life into the haves and the have-nots, the winners and the losers. Um, so I think you could make a great point about that. So I think from a kind of Kegan's model, you could probably say that Trump mainly is pre-conventional or operates from a Kegan stage 2, probably also from a ego development perspective. You would probably say that he's pre-conventional or operating from that self-protective, for the most part at least, stage of development. But if you looked at it from a spiral dynamics perspective, they would probably say, no, this is more ER or orange that express self in a kind of calculated way to maximize profits and benefits. After all, he's not a drug dealer or a warlord or anything like that, even though he does kind of seem to have that big boss, might is right type ethic, and he seems to admire dictators quite a bit. Um, but spiral dynamics would probably say no, Trump. That's more the archetype of orange and capitalism and entrepreneurship and making money and progress and showmanship and that sort of stuff. I'm going to read something for you here. The Never-Ending Quest by Clare Graves, and this is kind of interesting. Just how you can see that these models are different. So here we go. So when we talk about the fifth level here, that is spiral dynamics orange or Graves ER. And for those who would claim that they are equivalent, this would be the achiever stage or conscientious stage in ego development, and it would be Kegan stage 4, the institutional self or the self-authoring mind, right? So here goes. This is a quote from the book. A person operating at the fifth level has no compunction whatsoever about taking whatever he can get. He doesn't feel guilty to sit at a supper table and take more from a little kid if the kid can be inveigled into giving up what he's got, well, fine, go ahead and do it. The person at the 5th level seems life as a game, and that the big task in the game is to figure out how to circumvent the rules in order to win. This person very frequently shows actions which others perceive as hostile. If you saw this person in operation, you would say, my God, how can a person behave in such a hostile fashion? You got up to this person and say, Jim, how can you behave this way? How can you be so mean? I'm not mean, he would reply. There isn't a mean bone in my body. Never did a mean thing in my life. Now, there's one thing here. One could propose that 5th level values be called the Machiavellian system. The ethic of might is right. Now, if you read Loevinger's conscientious stage or the achiever stage, it does not at all sound like that. And if you read Kegan's self-authoring mind or stage 4, this does not at all map over onto that, right? But this maps perfectly onto Graves' ER, or Spiral Dynamics Orange. But if you compare it to Kegan's system, this would be Kegan stage 2. So if you look at the phenomena of Donald Trump, you could probably simultaneously say that from a ego development perspective and from a Kegan perspective, he probably operates primarily from stage 2. But from a spiral dynamics perspective, you would probably say, yeah, he has quite a bit of red, but he also, has a little bit of blue with the whole Make America Great Again patriotism speech. And he has heavy, heavy orange. This is mostly orange. By the way, in terms of ethics, I don't think Kamala Harris is likely any better. After all, she's the person who actively blocked, as a DA, blocked DNA testing for a person on death row who might very well be innocent in the Kevin Cooney case and other cases. But she probably operates from more of that achiever type logic, in the sense that she can say things like, this is true and this is also simultaneously true. There's more of that formal operations stuff going on, but that does not necessarily mean that she is a better human being. She can still be just as much as a politician and just as much as a snake as Donald J. Trump. I hope you found this enjoyable. In the next episode, we'll look at Spiral Dynamics Blue, Kegan Stage 3, and from ego development, the diplomat stage, and see what we can take from that. Till then, have a great time.